Today is September 2nd, 2022. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki naganago mekoche che stokom aki or dekot nagotine siku. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm speaking to the lands on the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Piikani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. As it is Pride here in Calgary, it's really important to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on this land by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. It's important that land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage all to introduce themselves with their acknowledgement of their ancestors, stories of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacements, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to say the local Indigenous names, if you won't use your pronouns, you won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around for my community, myself, my family. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you're from, you show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. If you were to read Jesse Wente's book on Reconciled on chapter 13, pages 180 to 181, I feel that explains it perfectly. So my Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the Hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Pincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary or in Blackfoot Mokinstis as Michelle Elliott, an English name that has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act and Post status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having a Canadian Indian Act and Post status card. It is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ plus community and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in Canada because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. As a Dene woman who's attempted to run after joining harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow incarceration, a denial of justice, denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples, I have worked to continue, reports to advocate for, and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I can't say I have a great pride knowing my community is dying from the current drug policies and systems of imposed based drug policies, abstinence programming, private healthcare, and justice systems built on racism, land theft, and imposed British constructs that continue genocide on Indigenous peoples. There are so many instances that we see every single day in the news of missing or murdered people. And if you're following my podcast, I'm talking a lot about Dawn Dumont Walker and her son, Vinnie Jansen, that went missing. They were found, and now we have the same lawyer that was defending Jian Ghomeshi now defending her. And I'm hoping that good things will come, but it's hard to know. Anyway, I think of them. I hope we honor their lives. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm as a citizen and see your role in reconciliation as well. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my name in Satu Dene. I was joking last night at a panel discussion that they're actually laughing and ribbing each other and going, "Can you believe the Southerner? How she said that?" That's okay. My humblest apologies to Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or interpretations of this entire podcast will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share my journey as I walk the Red Road. I've been accused of not being kind enough while surviving genocide. Yet I have given free book clubs, podcasts, and info on my social media for years, as so have many others. At this point, it is willful to be ignorant on these issues, and just a clear example of the anti-Indigenous bias that so many folks actually have. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to the previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. And also, if you just hate Patreon account and you can't figure it out, don't hesitate to send me an e-transfer at nativeyyc@gmail.com. Also, giving a review helps on whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And with that, I am going to welcome my friend Claren. Claren, would you like to introduce yourself in your way?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Claren Grosz, and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm right now in Toronto, which the name Toronto comes from Takaranto. I get to give a more extensive land acknowledgement than I normally would in Toronto, because in Toronto, everyone hears the same one again and again, but perhaps your listeners have not heard it. So Takaranto means like the meeting place where the trees meet the water. And I like to describe, in my play, I describe Toronto as like where unending city meets unending water. Like it's really like when you fly in, it's city as far as the eye can see, and then lake as far as the eye can see, right? Like it looks like a little ocean. I grew up visiting the Great Lakes as a kid, so I didn't really understand how phenomenal it was to have a fresh body of water that looks as big as an ocean from a little human perspective. So that's one of the things I like about Toronto. And Toronto is the treaty that Toronto is on, that's the right verb, is Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is actually a treaty that was made between, let me make sure I get this right. Who did it first? Oh no, I didn't write it down. I'm pretty sure it's the Mississaugas who had this treaty first, and then settlers came into it. So it was a pre-existing treaty that settlers came into. And, well, we can all imagine how well that went, and how much they honored the idea that we share this dish with one spoon and everyone participates fairly.
Yeah.
So but all the Indigenous people that are whose land this is the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Wendat, and the Chippewa. And then, of course, it's also home to almost 50% first-generation immigrants, as well as all the other descendants of immigrants that live here now. It's the biggest city in in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, my husband's done the demographics, and for some reason, half of my listeners are in Ontario. So I'm surprised anybody listens, frankly, let alone that half of them are from Ontario. So I think it's really great. In my land acknowledgement teaching, there's a really cute video from school board, and I think it's Redbird. Anyway, there's an elder there that really pushed land acknowledgements in the schools, and Duke Redbird, I want to say, there's a cute video of like the kids doing it and talking about it. So I love hearing you say it, because it just reminded me of that video, and I show it so that people see, this is everywhere. And I had a really bad interview with somebody today, or this past week, and I thought we were just setting up our computers to make sure it worked for me to come teach the land acknowledgement. And then it became, well, some of our people are across in other places of Canada. And I thought, you fucking prick, you don't even know what you're talking about. If you took my land acknowledgement training, you would know we'd teach you how to do it nationally, dumbass. So, it was so insulting. I just wrapped it up and basically sent him a little invoice and was like, and he called me a vendor, and I was so insulted because I thought, how many Indigenous people he's going to pick their brain and waste their time because he's an ignorant ass. And I thought, I will never ever work for this company in any capacity, and I'm going to tell all my friends privately, never work for. There was two companies that really screwed me over this past week, and like I can't even. I can't believe that people are so ignorant about land acknowledgements and how to engage Indigenous people. So, that's part of the reason why I wanted you to be on as a settler, as somebody who is trying to unpack what this means. I want my listeners to understand what reconciliation actually is, because I constantly, stress it's work. You have to do work. And you're doing work. You're making a play, and we're basically two Alberta girls from Calgary. And here, before I was more of an Indigenous activist, I used to draft wells and pipelines for land surveyors, and that's who your dad is, a land surveyor. So why don't you explain what you're doing, and we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote a play. It's titled I Love the Smell of Gasoline, and it's going up this October as part of the RUTAS International Performing Arts Festival in Toronto. Before it will have a full 2-week run in March with Nightwood Theatre in Toronto. And the play was my attempt to wrestle with this fact that my roots are Alberta oil industry roots. My dad worked in oil, and actually my grandpa also worked in oil before switching to nuclear. So my uncle works in nuclear. So big energy industry roots. And how do I hold that truth at the same time as the world is ending because of the fossil fuel industry, right? How do I, And I started writing the play in the fall of 2019 after the federal election, which is when Canada votes in a Liberal minority and a sea of blue swallows the prairies, not a speck of red for Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I'm getting phone calls from home of people who are really stressed about the layoffs that are happening. And I'm in Toronto, I've got people sharing memes that are mocking Albertans for being rednecks that have what's coming to them. And in these conversations that I was having with my parents, who very much are in the oil and gas world, and then my arts worker friends who are very much radical leftists.
As radical left as white people can be.
Oh, you assume all my friends are white.
Yeah, well, honestly, who is leading the colonial agenda of climate change? It's not Native people. And because white people are taking it over, it's just another form of colonialism. So for me, that's the huge gap we have, is that these white people think they know best, and they're patting us on the head. We'll save this for you. It's take responsibility for what you have done. And this is at least what you're trying to do, is okay, we have to unpack who did what and why are we here.
Yeah. And I think so that one of the things, in my little description on my website, it says I'm trying to reconcile these Alberta roots with this impending apocalypse. And I had an interview question recently that was so how are you doing that reconciliation? And I thought about this, the word reconciliation and this double meaning it has, because in that sentence, I'm intending it as how do I create harmony between these two contradicting truths in my body and my brain? How do I hold these things? But then, you said, there's also this act of reconciliation. You can't have this kind of conversation around land and environment without talking about Canada's genocidal history, right? kind of acknowledging that I am someone who has directly benefited from the exploitation of the land, right? Like as absolutely as you can possibly directly benefit. Like, so yeah, and I think my play is a lot about how you sit with dissonance, right? You have these two things that seemingly contradict each other, and you need to hold them in your head at the same time. And I think that people in general, or at least I'll speak for myself, I struggle to hold those two truths, right? Cognitive dissonance is a really uncomfortable feeling. And I think if we're so busy feeling uncomfortable sitting with that dissonance, then we can't move forward. And so my play is about, I think, creating space to emotionally process together. Like, how can I hold that I am complicit and I am responsible and I am futile and I am human? Like, how can I hold all these things about me at the same time, enough that I can then move forward and try and do some acting for good, right? And I think if we can afford ourselves that, then we can also extend that to other people. How can we understand, like, I think a lot of people approach climate change with moral absolutism, and being right is like the most important part, right? Which is also not helpful. We can't move forward if we're busy like pointing fingers and all that. So,
but that's the worst part. I don't think we are. I don't think that, like my uncle says, for every finger pointing out, there's 3 pointing back. And I have yet to see white, green activists be like, oh shit, colonialism caused climate change, and go, oh, okay, so can we at least start there? And they don't. They start over at this, what is conservative enough for us to talk about? And so just to back up a little bit about what you were saying, in 2019, I ran in the 2017 municipal one, and then provincially. And provincially, we were talking about, at the end of the day, globally, the rest of the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I felt our liberal agenda provincially was really strong on that, and talked about how we were going to transition and how we were going to help our industry and help the province in that move. And of course, we didn't get a single seat. And so that says a lot about us, obviously, talking about it. But I think it's back to that bigger picture of, there's just not room for civic conversation in Alberta. And so back to what you're saying, unpacking like the past. I mean, my dad is a product of the Mayflower. He has stolen land in Saskatchewan from his farm, his I guess it would be his grandfather's farm, so my great grandfather on his side. And then he came to Alberta to try to start a new life, met a native, had a baby, hello, and then moved up to Fort McMurray. And he was a union boilermaker, and the union boilermakers made Syncrude, made Suncor. And then my husband, his dad was a seismic guy, farmer's boy who became a seismic guy. And then we both ended up in land surveying, and we contributed 100% to all of this. And I grew up watching my dad and my mom fist fight. So it lit like that small dichotomy of Indigenous versus settler I've seen. And then now I see the bigger picture of it as well, where how it's constant. And ironically, I just get a kick out of Christians who are like, heaven is the most wonderful place where there's lots of food and there's lots of water and it's so nice. And I'm like, oh, so what was here prior to you imposing your Christian agenda? Got it.
That can be heaven
right?
on earth. You can make that happen.
Right? So until I see Christians understand the gravity of everything they've done, I just know we're not even close to being honest about what climate change was the root of, and moving forward. And I've seen a study this week about, the carbon footprint of average Joe compared to capitalism. We're being encouraged to ride bikes and reduce our carbon footprint. Yet these capitalist pigs just get away with every single bit of stealing and exploiting and murdering Indigenous people in order to exploit that land. And we have done nothing about it. And, it's so funny because I have nothing but awful criticism to say about Jason Kenney and anyone who supported them in any capacity. And yet they have at least an action plan for the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry at a provincial level that nobody's talking about. So, if our own companies who were like, oh my God, Jason Kenney's the best thing, let's lick his boots and be happy, if they're not going to implement the very policies that he created, how are we ever going to move forward? Because these companies need to see that. So last night I had a wonderful conversation. There's an organization called Pride at Work, and we talked about basically making work more inclusive. And while the focus is obviously a lot on the LGBTQ plus community, for Two-Spirit and Indigenous people, I talked about the anti-Indigenous bias and the policies of TRC, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And now provincially, we have the 113 pathways of justice moving forward. And here in Calgary, we have the White Goose Flying Report. And I said, when I walk into most businesses, they have these proud Canadian flags. And I'm like, if I don't see orange, then I know they have no idea what they're doing and what they're talking about, and that it is absolutely an exclusive space for settlers and white people, not Indigenous. So like we have a lot to address in order to make it safe for Two-Spirit. I just can't even imagine how we're going to have these conversations, because it's back to that finger pointed. If nobody is willing to look at themselves and see themselves in this concept of reconciliation, how are we going to get there? And then I see these really stupid organizations worried about what the police are doing when they should be focused on churches. Like what are the churches doing? The fact that they just absolved themselves of the legal settlement to Indigenous people for the atrocities of genocide they committed at the Indian residential school. Like, we have to talk about these things in order to move forward. So like back to gasoline, your play, sovereignty. It comes down to sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And because there has never been economic wealth sharing in any capacity, worse, imposed poverty on Indigenous people, and then the exploitation of the land, we're in a real pickle. All of the buffalo that used to be here, all the caribou that used to be here, the way of life that we have, now poisoned thanks to the nuclear energy programs and the fossil fuel industries and the coal. We had a big fight down south, what was happening in the mountains, that even white people were like, oh my God, we got to fight this. Beer companies were saying, hey, don't pollute the water down south with coal mining. And I thought, how bad is it that even beer companies are on the same side as Indigenous people? Because, industry just wants to kill everything. They want to kill water. They want to kill the land. They want to kill all of the animals, all the habitats, and of course the Indigenous people, so that they can feel good about land theft. So like, this is a lot to unpack. And I think that that gravity, you can't put that in a play, but you and I can talk about it here, at least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you've listed so many different moving parts of the problem, right?
Yep.
And it can feel really overwhelming to like try and grapple with all of that and to try and understand all of that. And I think I would say, like, this is what I tell myself, is it's not up to, like, as an individual, I don't need to understand all of the moving parts. I am not equipped to handle all of the moving parts. There's some people, like politicians, should be able to do that, right? That's their job.
Honestly, they are so useless. I can't even, it's like I'm helping the NDP provincially, but they were in power for 4 years, and their so-called conversations on anti-racism literally wants me to take a bat to people's knees. Like, there's so much racism. There's so much misogyny. There's so much of it here. Mm-hmm. And the idea that anybody could even possibly deny that. And then, of course, people like Christiana Freeland get attacked in her own hometown. It's like, what will it take in order for Albertans to understand the gravity of violence that is just embedded in our society here? It's so ugly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm very good at there's a reason I don't work in politics and like holding those like big things. Like, one of the things I do to come back into my comfort space, into that place where I can still act, like I don't feel paralyzed by the weight of the situation. The unovercomableness of the situation is to think about, what can I do in my day-to-day life? Like, what does reconciliation look like in my personal day-to-day life? And what does anti-racism look like in my day-to-day life? What does being an environmentalist look like in my day-to-day life?
Sure.
And because I think, and I understand, I hear a lot of people too arguing how, like, you know, individual action is not going to solve the world's problems, right? And I'm like, absolutely, individual action alone is not going to, but it has, at the same time, like, I can't do anything but individually act, right? And I think there's one image in my play that I think is important for how I conceptualize, which is when you watch those birds, like starlings, fly in that cloud. And there's not one of them that's leading, right? But if they all kind of have the same intention to go right, then they're going to end up going right, right? Mm-hmm. I think humans are the same. One bird flying out of the flock is not gonna do anything. But if you can, like, work with your flock and put your intention into where you want that flock to go, that's like the best that we can do. And it's like, you know, changing the social fabric, right? Like, I don't have any connections in government, but I have connections who have connections who have connections in government. And if I'm working at changing the social fabric where I am, I can only hope that that is going to have ripple out effects, you know?
And I think that is exactly what I hope settlers hear. Like, you know, I encourage people to join book clubs or create them. Like, that is that social fabric that needs to change so that we start using more inclusive language and have a more inclusive understanding. Because if we don't, like, and I'm a big believer that arts is the reason why our social fabric does change. Because, you know, Michael Moore coming out and talking about how ridiculous gun culture is, or not having healthcare, like all these things really do help change culture, I think. So I would never underestimate the power of art. My ex-employer, she's still a fabulous person. Anyway, she really expresses herself through art, and she'll come to protests wearing a ridiculous costume, but the costume is representing the subject of the day, right? Mm-hmm. And so you don't even have to speak. You can just, your art is speaking for you. So to me, I think the work that you're doing here is really important because, you know, it's hard to imagine, and I tell people this, like, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, if it was really implemented in downtown Calgary for real, it would actually have global effects, because so many mining companies and oil companies, fossil fuel companies, are directly in downtown core, and they do it globally. So globally, people in the Amazon are being murdered down in South America, and they're all funneled through Calgary. So if we could actually implement UNDRIP meaningfully, could you imagine the ripple effect of actually, you know, helping climate change in such a good way? So like, to me, your play is so important, and I hope we could even make it a movie one day, because it is a bit of a slice of insight of what it's like to be an Albertan, what it's like to grow up here, what it's like to have it in the air. And then you go to Toronto where you can talk about it a lot more freely, because if you were here, like, I don't know what would happen to you. You know, this is these are the people who left right where I grew up in Sylvan Lake. They went to Ottawa, had like nooses, talked about lynching, you know, killing our prime minister. Down south at the border here in Alberta, they had 4 people who legitimately had plans to murder the RCMP. Now, if I had any plans to murder the RCMP or kill our prime minister, I'm pretty sure I would be in jail indefinitely.
Oh, absolutely, you would. Right?
You know, and that's the ironic part. I'm not white enough for the white community, even though I'm a daughter of the Mayflower. You know, I understand growing up in this province what it's like to be an Albertan, but I'm too native for them, right? Because I talk about sovereignty and Indigenous rights. Now, Danielle Smith, who's white, can talk about sovereignty, and everybody's like, oh my God, I still want to vote for that, but not this native, right? I'm too native for that, and I just don't know if we're going to get anywhere when you have folks that legitimately care about this area, want to see the best for everybody. And back to politicians, like, I'm sorry, but I don't put politicians in a lot of authority when it comes to dealing with this. Not at the provincial level or the municipal level. The opposite. I see municipal leaders regularly approving more land expansion, which is more colonialism at a local level. So now federally, obviously, I don't feel that way. The science and innovation grant that my husband's company worked at is taking a lot of the flares that would normally be burnt off and repurposing that and reusing it to create green energy. And that's the direction that I want the whole province to go towards. So we're really lucky that my husband's in this company doing the work there. And and again, nobody would have a job there if it wasn't for Justin Trudeau and for liberal policies and science and innovation. And yet that conversation's not out there. It's suppressed by, the conservative media. And I say even the CBC is conservative media because it was Harper who appointed all of the board of directors. So like this is a conversation nobody wants to have in Alberta. And in Alberta, everybody's like CBC, that's just liberal propaganda.
Yeah.
And it's so offensive and conservative to me. I can't even listen to it. I've been on a break and my life has improved for not listening to CBC Alberta or Alberta or CBC Calgary, because they don't even know how racist they sound. They're just like pro-colonialism, settler viewpoint, and I just can't even listen to them. I just get too upset even hearing it now. And more recently, they just have so much propaganda that's pro-conservative, so I can't even listen to it. Yeah. Anyway, so it's a lot to unpack what's happening here. And you and I are just growing up in this environment trying to figure out, okay, we have these conversations about reconciliation. We have these conversations about energy. How do we make this work? And I believe that your play is at least trying to open that window a bit.
Yeah, I think trying to open the window so that people can have conversations about it without coming for each other's throats right off the bat. And I say that I understand why people go for each other's throats, right? That is not to diminish anyone's emotional response that they have in these kind of conversations, right? But I think, for example, in my circles of environmentalists in Toronto, they have so many great points, and they know a lot of stuff that I don't know. Like, they know more than I do, for sure. But they don't know anything about what it's like to work in the oil and gas industry. And they don't know anything about, like, the thing that you just mentioned of the gas flares and harnessing that again. They would never have heard of that. Like, they don't know that's happening. And like stuff like that. So I'm like, if only, like, how do you, who are so informed in so many ways, how can you have conversations with people who know that stuff, but perhaps don't know all the environmental stuff? Like, how can we, and again, I'm sure that those conversations are happening, but they're not happening enough, right? There's not enough of those conversations. So yeah, the goal in my play, the grandiose goal, I mean, theater is limited in its scope, but it's to start building some of those bridges so that people can come together and have more productive conversations.
Yeah, I believe that. And one of the things that we did federally that apparently provincially there's still some issues as well, but if you convert those abandoned wells into geothermal, they're easy to do. We have all the engineers, all of the infrastructure in order to do it. One, we're going to be getting a lot more green energy, and two, they're not being abandoned. There's a better way to do all of this, right? And but I guess there's still some limitations. I was door knocking and I came across a fellow who said that this doctorate who in geothermal was presenting, and I'm like, that's great. Why? Back to what you were saying about how through people that there's political influence. Here's the problem: is that people like that, this academic who knows what the issues are for geothermal, they're not at the liberal table. Like, we're putting forward liberal policy right now. And if this person could somehow engage with us in any capacity, we could make that change right now. But the problem is that average Joe citizen doesn't have that civic dialogue in them at all.
Oh,
then they're not coming to the table. So literally the solutions of, folks who are at the table who want to see that change, there's a gap there. So to
yeah.
me, it's important to start putting that out there, like, okay, here is the gap. And I'm really sad. Here it is, 2022, and we have all these folks that believe we're getting implanted with microchips, but we can't get people who are doctorates in geothermal to come to the table, the Liberal Party, so that we can change this issue right now. Like, how this is the easiest thing for us to do, and yet we're all, like you said, pointing fingers. And it's
Mhm.
like, we're not having meaningful conversations about inclusion. We were just talking about one of the major engineering companies that I won't name on the podcast. I said, I applied for a job and I had to give them my COVID vaccine records in order to even apply for the job. So they have it. They never got back to me. They eventually gave me the, oh, we're not interested in you. But the panel discussion that we had last night at Pride at Work, some of the folks there were at this company and they're not there anymore. So we were actually talking about how Alberta as a whole is like, they have these great inclusion, diversity policies, but now their practices are showing the opposite, where they are not inclusive in any capacity. And for the most part, all of the jobs are going towards, again, the white male. And of course, we talk about the she economy because we know the first people that were excluded from everything in COVID were the women, right? And
Mm.
and we're in such a, like, I feel like we went back 50 years in Alberta because of COVID, honestly.
Oh
And
yeah.
you have a whole energy sector that it's like, making ridiculous amounts of profits, but not hiring back the people that created the infrastructure for them to make this money.
No, yeah, it feels like just basic, like kindergarten level, like how do we treat other people? That if corporations could just apply that, like it doesn't seem like it should be that hard.
It
Like
shouldn't
that makes
be.
me feel so frustrated.
I know.
Like, yeah, the people who got you where you are, you owe them something. Like, what the heck?
One of my favorite lines in your play that you took, that we talked about as a family, was, the you might love the oil industry, but the oil industry does not love you back. And I,
Mhm.
I can't stress how true that is over and over and over again. And so I'm really excited for you to do this play. I'm hoping it's like widely loved, because it gives that dialogue that I think we need to start having together, where it's more than just, acknowledging Indigenous people exist, acknowledging that we might actually have some, genocide here, but that bigger picture of, like, we created a big mess with
Yeah.
hiding all of this information from each other. So now what do we do? And like, the kids, they don't have time for us not dealing with climate change. They don't have time for us. In fact, and because in Alberta, women and those who identify as LGBTQ2 plus have been so marginalized from the economic workforce. Like, our kids are moving. They don't want to have anything to do with this place at all. And I don't want that. I don't want people to leave here. We have clean water, for God's sakes. There's not very many places anymore that have it. And even our clean water isn't clean everywhere. We gotta protect it. And I just don't feel like there's an understanding to any of this here in Alberta. And I don't understand why. I guess it's just easier to get up and move. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a thing, like a cultural thing, just nationally speaking, of not rooting yourself somewhere, like not indigenizing yourself to where you are and the land you are on. But what if you can just leave? It also says something about your relationship to community. And I say this as someone who I moved across the country, right? Like, and I would move again if the right job offered itself up, right? But it does speak to our culture of our lack of rooting ourselves to place and to community, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. You said you had roots out there though, hey, that you had gone out and visited Toronto quite a bit when you were younger.
Yeah, actually, because my parents did the opposite thing. They were both raised in Ontario and they went to Alberta when jobs were hot. And then they have really been like, we are Calgarian. I'm like, well, maybe you should come be with me now in Ontario. And they're like, no, we are here now. Which is actually, I think, a funny like spirit too for Alberta, is that I think, correct me if you think this is not true, but Alberta is also a province of like immigrants with even just like from other places in Canada. Like,
Yeah. Well, we
really
all joke
new
that Fort
city.
McMurray is like all Newfies. Like,
Yeah, like it's a city that most people, a lot of people were not raised and born in Calgary. Like it is a place where, and so the provincial or the city municipal spirit is, funnily enough, people that weren't raised there, but they've got this sense of community. Anyway, interesting.
yeah, well, look at Jason Kenney, he pretends to be Mr. Alberta. And I mean, at the end of the day, he grew up in Saskatchewan. He's not from here. And a lot of people here call him Mr. Ottawa because he spent so much time in Ottawa. And there's a rumor, I don't know how true it actually is, that his mailing address in Calgary was like his mom's seniors building. So everyone joked that he lives in his mom's basement, which is not true, but you know what I mean? It's funny. So
it's fun to joke about anyway.
Yeah. So like, I mean,
in the way of a good joke, right?
Right. But at the end of the day, that is the truth. And then, ironically, a lot of the first generation Canadians and Calgarians, like I think of like a Nenshi, I think of Jody Gondek, they're never accepted as true Calgarians. And it's like, they've lived here most of their life, if not all of their life. I think Andrew Fung was born here, and like here are people that were born and raised here that aren't considered from here and get that question, no, where are you really from? Right. And that's ironically part of the reason why I want people to introduce themselves, do that acknowledgement, do their history, so that we know who they are and where they come from. And yet we're not there as a society. Instead we're still back to that, well, people shouldn't ask me that. And it's like, okay, well then how do you see your role in reconciliation? And they're newer immigrants and they're like trying to adapt and white code and do the Canadian coding that you're expected to do, and they don't care. All they've been taught is propaganda and hate against Indigenous already, and they see it in the media, the erasure or negative talk in the mainstream. So it's we have so much work to do in Alberta. It's really hard for me to hope that we're going to see a lot of change soon, when I've seen a lot of backward change in the last 2 years. I don't know. What was it like for you to be out in Toronto and watching all of this freedom convoy crap and all of this like misinformation, anti-science? What was that like for you?
I mean, flabbergasting, astounding. It's hard to believe the numbers, right? Like, of course, there's always going to be people on the peripheries who think all sorts of things. I think that's actually probably a healthy part of society, right? But
sure,
that to that extent, and of course they chose their mode of protest to be running the engines on these massive trucks nonstop. Like, I was just like, oh my God, like how horrific. Like, tell me you don't care about literally anyone else. Like,
right?
Just so, and I'm like, the lack of like, I get civil protest, whatever. I think people should be able to protest non-violently, but I'm like, it is violent to run semi trucks and take up the capital city for weeks on end and like make so much noise that people can't sleep. Like, that is violent. That is not peaceful.
That's torture. By UN convention, it's actually torture.
Yeah, exactly. And again, we know that the roots of that, like, that was organized by white supremacists. So like, I don't know, that was really frustrating to watch, and just, I don't know, hard to wrap my head around. I have a really hard time. I think I am a bit naive in the way that I navigate the world, and like really wanting to believe the best in people, and that like, people are products of their environments, and but they all ultimately, people are all trying to do their best, right? Yep. Stuff like that kind of breaks my brain. It makes it hard to like hold on to that.
Yeah. Well, and same with the anti-mask. Like
Yeah,
it,
absolutely.
it it just shows like how much do you really care about community,
Yeah, and
right?
I'm like, even if you don't believe in it, even if, it
Hmm.
costs you nothing to wear a mask. So what
Right,
if it works? Even
right.
just what if it works, you should do it. It's gonna cost you nothing. Like just wear
No,
a mask.
right?
And I think I speak in my play about my dad was diagnosed with cancer this year, and pretty like pancreatic, so really lethal stuff, and was waiting on life-changing surgery. And the day before his surgery, it was canceled. And I think the day after that, I watched the like freedom people, like anti-vax and anti-mask people walk by the condo that my parents are in. And I was like, oh, like, like my dad can't have surgery because of you.
Pretty
Like,
much. Yeah, pretty much. And I'm not afraid to say this on the podcast. I will never, ever, ever buy another sausage from Spalumbo's because they've been actively allowing that. So like even last night I was driving down Inglewood and all of these freedom convoy people are protesting. And it's like, nobody's forcing you to wear a mask. No one's forcing you to get vaccinated. Like it's insanity to me that these folks,
yeah,
like out of all
what
of
are you
the things you
protesting
could
now?
protest, this is your hill to die on when there's so
Like,
many
that's
other
what.
things that need help in this town, city, province, and country. I it's so selfish. It's so selfish. So I've lost a lot of respect for a lot of folks over it. And I mean, I can drive out of my clothes. In my clothes, I can see at least two, fuck Trudeau bumper stickers, and then driving out there's people who are like proud to say part of the fringe minority and stuff like that. Like I'm surrounded by these yahoos, surrounded by them. And so I know I'm not safe. Like I knew I wasn't safe before because this is the neighborhood that Colton Croce was murdered.
Oh,
And you know for 3 weeks was lying dead in a pond that nobody could see, find, or anything. So like I know I'm not safe here, but like now we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and there's such an individualistic, selfish sense from everybody here. It's so disheartening because you want to believe, like you said, in the better of people,
mhm.
but I don't see it right now.
Yeah,
The
it's really
opposite. I
very
just see like
challenging.
the selfishness, and it's so alarming.
And I think that part of it too is I'm like, it's not real. Like it's about the vaccines, it's about the masks, it's about whatever. But I think it's actually more about community. Like I think the people who really get sucked into that are people who did not have a sense of community, and all of a sudden this fringe group is providing them with that sense of community. And like for whatever reason, they're feeling ostracized by the left, they're feeling ostracized by the woke, and they're finding solace in whatever. And uh, I don't know. The whole thing just is
Yeah.
so heartbreaking, like, and furious that people like, can't they see that what they're missing is a sense of community? Like, yeah, it's super hyper individualist. And I'm like, but actually what you want is other people. Like, if no,
Well, I'm seeing the rise in fascism. That's what I'm seeing, right? Like
yeah,
I feel
absolutely.
like we're in 1930s Germany, and folks who identify as not white, male, straight Christian are going to be are at risk from point blank, and it just sucks. So I hope that plays like yours help start changing that dialogue. Having folks out east see like, you know, the folks that went out there and protested is a very small group of people, but all Albertans are now labeled that way. To be frank, I mean, in our policies, there's a good reason for it. I'm not going to lie that we have so much work to do here. But like, I wish that folks who have any sense of responsibility would really vote that way, right? Because like, I don't know if you've ever met any conservative MLA, city councilor, or MP. They're so draining with their ignorance. It's frightening actually that they know nothing other than how do I make capitalist economy better? That's it. And even then, a lot of folks who are identifying as conservative, poli sci, masters or doctorate in economics, even they said like, please remember all of the stuff we learned in university is theory. So that's why we're seeing the collapse of like the supply chain and procurement the way we are. I just don't think our politicians understand that. And I'm hoping our voters are starting to see like these guys are airheads who had nothing more than a whole bunch of dad's money to go to university and get economics degrees, but they have no way of utilizing it personally. I actually challenged a door knocker. I door knock and I challenged somebody. I knocked doors on. They're like, well, at least Kenny has world experience at work. And I said, what job are you talking about? Like, what did he do outside of politics? And then it was stammering. So like they are being told a lie and perpetuating a lie. And when you call them on it, they can't dissect that lie. So, I'm hoping people will wake up. And I hate that they've taken the term woke and made it something so awful, because it's like literally knowing a little more about life is not the worst thing in the world, is it not? Like understanding different cultures and that, right? I remember growing up in like 1995 and everybody lost their crap over an RCMP or wearing a turban, like lost it. And there's a Legion that's in Red Deer and they still have a sign that says no turbans allowed. And Manmeet Bhullar took a picture under it to kind of be like, yeah, that's what I think. And then he passed away shortly after. And but I was really proud of him for doing that, because the end of the world has not happened because we allow turbans in our Canadian military and Canadian police.
Pick your battle, like,
right.
what?
And I remember that was the same time as gay marriage too. Like we were having these conversations and Ralph Klein was like, we'll use the notwithstanding clause to allow gays to get married. Like, I'm like, yeah, look, the end of the world didn't happen.
I also think I'm like, what is this inconsistency of worldview that like these people are so individualist and all for individual freedom, except for individual's right to wear a turban and individual's right to get married to whoever they want to get married to. I'm like, okay, so you don't actually so you're just lying. You're lying about your worldview. Like you don't have a set of core values. You just are selfish.
Yeah, and that's just it, because there's no reason why a Muslim shouldn't have a day off at Eid. There's no reason why Indigenous people shouldn't have time off to go to Sundance, right? But
no, there's no reason any of us shouldn't get much more time off, just generally speaking. Like,
right? I have really enjoyed chatting with you, because very rarely do two Alberta girls get to talk about Alberta and just be honest about it. And our commonality is your dad was a land surveyor and I used to draft the wells and pipelines that folks like your dad would have surveyed. So
yeah, maybe you would work on a project once, who knows? Did you ever work with Caltech?
Yeah, my husband did, actually. I never drafted for them, but my husband did. And I worked for McElhaney and North Can Surveys. And that's when I left for maternity leave. I was at North Can Surveys. So
there you go.
Yeah, and I worked for Can-Am for 5 minutes while I was going to SAIT to get my drafting courses under my belt. So, and they were really good. Actually, I was working for them at 9/11. So,
oh wow.
Yeah, and that day was really scary. They shut down all of the skyscrapers because everybody was afraid, and we were like, what if they try to bomb our delivery packages? So like we all went home early that day because and I was like, I called the airport like, hey, do we have to bring in like refugees because they shut down everything? And they were like really brushing that off. And then of course we heard about Gander. So, yeah, anyway, I don't know how I ended up there, sorry. Oh, what a pleasure. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? Like, when does your play start?
It goes up the October 6th, 7th, and 8th at the Factory Studio. So soon. It's like we start rehearsals on Tuesday, so I'm really excited.
Oh, that's awesome. Don't hesitate to send me the links and I will promote the crap out of them, because if we have some Ontario followers, half of you, I guess, listen to me. Thank you for listening to me. We'd love for, if you're in the Toronto area, for you to go see this play, because I think it's really important that we have real discussions of what Alberta is like. And I mean, I hate that we have to engage with Nazis in order to de-radicalize them, but if that's what we got to do, that's what we got to do. So.
And I also want to say, because I don't think we mentioned this, is that the reason that we know each other is because you helped me out. that you had several different conversations with me and helped me shape the script. And that was super, super helpful. So I don't think we acknowledged that on the podcast. That's how we know each other. So thank you.
Yeah,
for
no, it
helping make
honestly,
this
it's
thing
been
come
an
true.
honor. So, because I believe we need to have these conversations, and I'm so grateful to be a part of that. And frankly, you paid me. That's part of it. And I really think that people don't understand a simple act of reconciliation is paying people for consulting, because out here it's expected for you to do free community labor. And that's why our community is falling apart, because there's very few people that can afford to do that.
We need reciprocity, and money is a good form of being reciprocal back. Yeah.
An imposed Western economy, it sure is. That's for sure.
Yeah. In the current context. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for your time today. Thank you for doing this work with the play. And I hope that, that this is something that um, goes beyond just Toronto. I hope we can
I hope I
play
can
it
bring it
here
to
in Calgary, and I hope that people will go to it and go, yeah, because I know we have lots of like progressive folks here that need to start these conversations. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and cultural safety training, cultural first aid, and all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous people of color, those with a disability, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. I want to say thank you to authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of heretohelp.bc.ca. And they have a great section of what is Indigenous cultural safety and why should I care about it. So like this link right here that I've been saying for like 4 years, had the two folks who I had really bad interactions with, these two companies, had they read this, would we have even had that problem? Probably not. So folks, if you're really struggling, there's so much work you can do. Anyway, their work in those cultural action tools, I've said in my podcast, if you literally Google Indigenous cultural safety, you will find like so many more links now, because so many people have wrote about it, because we all experience it. I'm just lucky to highlight it and repeat it here as part of reconciliation and settler understanding. Internalized racism or lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized folks experience by the structure of racism. The good way to put it is, it's safer for me to attack an Indigenous person than it is the structure of racism. So that's why you'll see that, and you'll see women fighting, because it's easier to attack women than it is to attack the misogyny that is on us. So anyway, racial equity tools.org. There's tons of resource files, and What is Internalized Racism is by Donna Bevins. So a huge shout out to her for all the work she does. I'm grateful to highlight it here. So American Friends Service Committee, they have do's and don'ts for bystander intervention. Again, this is another thing, like, what do you do when you see marginalized people? You can Google it and find tons of more resources. So afsc.org and do's and don'ts bystander intervention. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay-straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform and violence prevention, 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. And if you're in Alberta, you have 113 pathways of justice now that your own damn conservative government that you voted for actually made. So challenge your stupid leaders on this. Like, I can't even with them, but if you're like, oh my God, I just love the blue, I just gotta vote the blue, you better know what I'm talking about, and you better be pushing your politicians on this. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from the election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. This should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sport clubs, etc. Great article that is out there is Truth Before Truth, How Non-Indigenous Canadians Become Allies. Again, there are actually multiple articles out there about that now. If you're experiencing emotional distress after hearing anything we talked about today and want to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness Helpline at 855-242-3310. It is toll-free, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can also text the hopeforwellness.ca. They have one of those little text boxes. Anyway, if more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. For non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area, functioning 211, or 833-456-4566. And any of you who noticed, Justin Trudeau actually announced this week that November of next year, they're going to have a national hotline as well for mental health, suicide prevention, which I hope is true. We'll see how it works anyway. And I'm not really too sure like why when I just gave you this number, but whatever, figure it out. The 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta, ssisa.ca. We're going to have a march here in Calgary. I've been sharing the poster, so please come to it in October. October 4th, of course, then Sisters in Spirit vigils nationally. So wherever you are in Canada, go to your local Sisters in Spirit vigil on October 4th. If you see or experience racism in Alberta, you can report it to Act to End Racism or text at 587-507-3838. If you are LGBTQ2+, first of all, happy Pride here in Calgary. We march on Sunday. I'm super excited to go with the Liberals. I think my girl's going to be with USAY. There's going to be some great organizations to march with. Anyway, lifevoice.ca has some great crisis supports. Trans Lifeline is 877-330-6366 in Canada. And the LGBTQ youth line for the Trevor Project is 866-844-7386. And I'm just going to do an extra plug for Pride at Work. They're Toronto based and they help with policy development so that your place of work can be more inclusive to include LGBTQ2+. And again, if you are not Indigenous inclusive, we know the moment we come in and see your Canadian flag, no orange, no land acknowledgement in your emails, we know. So consider working with Pride at Work or other organizations like that to make your workplace a more inclusive space. On August 31st was the International Overdose Awareness Day, and we had a wonderful event down here. Thank you so much to all of the folks that created that. Important work that everybody's doing. I actually came across a Sutina walk group that were doing their walk. So I started to give them my Narcan. I'll probably continue to do that. Anyway, if you know anyone who's using substances, please do not use alone. If you are using alone, you can contact the National Overdose Response Service at 888-688-NORS for support. And there's two apps you can download, the Brave app or the DORS app. And that can also help you if you are using alone. And of course, if you are Indigenous and you're in Alberta, you have free access to a Narcan a day. Please talk to your pharmacist about it, but all Albertans have access to free naloxone kits. And they're easy to learn to use. Please have them on you. Even if you don't know how to use them, chances are you're going to be with somebody else who does. We need to stop these drug poisonings that are happening over hundreds a month. So we need to stop this. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care, how I take my power back, why I started this podcast, to speak freely without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions. Is a lot of people don't want to hear Indigenous opinion, but sure want to tell us theirs. by people who know nothing about us, nothing about colonialism, nothing about the constant surveillance of Indigenous peoples, our protests, our vigils, and our rights. I and many others share info on microaggressions daily, so it's unacceptable to say them anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism, gatekeepers, folks that survive off the status quo, and people who are so in their trauma, they stop people from doing the work and deplete personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous people, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC, and others. I do want to say thank you, though, to my ancestors, to my granny and my mom on what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and stepping up to teach me to be a proud Calgarian. Just through her, I am a second generation Calgarian, my daughter being a third. Thank you to Darcy, Big Buffalo Rockman, for being my childhood friend, producing and editing this show, my husband, the father of our child, my support down my journey of the Red Road and witnessing decades of racism and sexism, and to our child, Thunderpipe Necklace Woman. We are so blessed to learn from you daily, and we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. My hope is my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. I also have a YouTube channel that we can go and subscribe to, and nativecalgarian.com has the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. I want to end by giving side-eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not your dish. My beautiful cousin responded, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you so much for listening. Join the book club, and the Reconciliation Action crew has heard of your work here from September to December. Thank you so much, and thank you to my guest, Claren, for coming. I appreciate it.